Thank you all for coming. I am grateful to the Balch Institute for making this possible. And thank you to Michael Fox, bookseller. Thank you also to Michael Fox, the bookseller, for making this possible. You know, every family has a legend of origins. There might have been a Sicilian who set foot on Ellis Island in 1900 and established a family on the Lower East Side of New York. There might have been a Scandinavian who immigrated in the 19th century and settled, establishing a farming family in the Midwest. There might have been a grandmother, if you're black, who came north from Georgia to settle in Baltimore and run a general store and establish a family there. Well, in my family, our family was no different. The legend, the reality, was that we were slave owners. We weren't slave owners who owned 2 or 3 field hands who worked in a 10-acre cotton patch. The Ball family of South Carolina controlled a dynasty of plantations populated by thousands of African Americans. The story began in 1698 when the first member of the family immigrated from England to settle at a plantation called Cumming-T, where there were 10 Africans and Native American slaves. 167 years later, the Balls got out of plantation slavery when stragglers from Sherman's army arrived on the lawns to force emancipation. During the 5 generations between those dates, the Balls enslaved close to 4,000 Africans and African Americans on 25 rice plantations north of Charleston, South Carolina, on the Cooper River. The descendants of those workers number between 75,000 and 100,000 living Americans today. It's a big story. When I was a child, my father used to tell me stories about the Ball plantations. I learned a lot about our ancestors. I learned what the Balls ate. I learned where they traveled. I learned the names of the people they fell in love with. But he never said much about the slaves. My father didn't know much about them. And I think, quite honestly, that he didn't want to know. I was born in Savannah, raised in South Carolina, in Louisiana and Florida. Southern boy. But I went north to college, where I learned, among other things, to lose my Southern accent. I settled in New York, where I began writing for newspapers and magazines. My father died when I was young, but the year he died, he presented me with a book, the published history of the family. It was called Recollections of the Ball Family of South Carolina. 200 pages long, a memoir published by our own family in 1909. And by giving me this book, I think he was trying to say that here was a piece of unfinished business that one day I would have to look into. In New York, I came south from time to family reunions. But for the most part, I concentrated on my work for newspapers and magazines. I remembered my Southern childhood as much as I distanced myself from it. But the stories my father told me percolated in my mind. They came back, and I kept taking the book off the shelf. Each time I came back to New York from a Southern visit, the book came down off the shelf, and I wondered what this legacy possibly could mean to me. I knew that the plantations had shaped my life, but I wasn't able or willing to look it in the eye and actually figure out how that had happened. One year there came in the mail an invitation to a family reunion in Charleston. And this time I decided to attend, and I decided I would try to educate myself about the black side of the story, about which I knew very little. And I decided, furthermore, that I would seek out black families whose ancestors were enslaved by my family, in an effort to make a gesture of reconciliation, however personal and however inadequate to those families for what had happened, for what my family had done. I found a publisher who was generous enough to give me an advance, which is in effect a loan, so I could quit my job and move from New York to Charleston and start the research. I did that in 1994, and I dove in. The Ball family, as it happened, were very finicky record keepers. They wrote down everything that happened, and they kept every scrap of paper that they wrote on. Ultimately, there were 10,000 pages of records coming from the Ball plantations, which were donated to libraries around the South, and all are preserved in public hands in archives in the South. I started studying these records, trying to educate myself about what actually happened on the plantations, the names of the black families, what their jobs were, who their children were, how they lived, how they suffered, how they overcame, as well as educating myself about my own family in the big houses, in detail, how they behaved, what they loved, what they hated. I'd like to show you some of the things that I found out. Now, would someone sitting next to the slide projector switch it on? Thank you. I can't quite control the focus from here. It's all right? First member of the family to go into plantation slavery was a man called Elias Ball, known affectionately in our clan as Red Cap, because he wore this red hat in this painting in order to disguise his baldness. Baldness is still a family trait. He was born in 1676 in Devonshire, England. This is the house of one of his cousins, a Ball family farmhouse that still stands in Devon, a 17th century thatched roof, stone and stuccoed building. Elias himself did not live here, but he must have visited here because the house was standing during his lifetime. At the head of the driveway, there is still this stone marker that says this was once Ball family farmland. At age 22, Elias inherited something from his uncle in South Carolina, which was then a nascent colony. He inherited 350 acres and some 20 Africans and Native American workers. In the beginning of plantation slavery, Indians were enslaved alongside Africans. So at 22 in the year 1698, he came to Charleston, South Carolina, and went up the Cooper River, 25 miles, to take possession of this land. This is Cumming Tea Plantation, the main house that was built there by Elias Ball. The ruins of this house still stand surrounded by pine trees in the forest. Elias married a woman named Elizabeth Harleston, another English immigrant, and they had 5 children, including Elias Jr., who was a chip off the old block. He expanded the family holdings and expanded his waistline, buying 600 acres 3 miles away from his father's land and naming that place Kensington Plantation. He had this house built for him at Kensington. This was the master's dwelling house there in 1747. And as you can see, the houses built by the first rice plantation owners were modest wooden boxes. The white people regarded South Carolina as the fringe of the wilderness, and they were not able or willing to build mansions in the forest. So they built very modest buildings. It was only 100 years later, after the boom in cotton that spread across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, that you began to get the grand Greek Revival mansions that we normally associate with plantation slavery. There are no surviving paintings that would show how black people lived in the 1700s in South Carolina, and nothing from the Ball paintings that were made. So what I've done is to borrow a photograph from 100 years later that was taken on a Ball place called Cedar Hill, a picture of a man named Pino who lived as a slave to the Balls in the 1800s, just to suggest how black people might have lived in the era before the American Revolution. Elias and Elizabeth had more children, including Anne Ball, who married a man named George Austin, whose firm, Austin and Lawrence, was a slave importing firm. So by the second generation, the Ball family were not only plantation owners, they were also slave traders. The family domain expanded. Many paintings were commissioned, including this one of a boy named Isaac Ball, painted in 1765. The state of South Carolina. You see at the bottom right, the yellow blotch is Charleston and the Cooper River, which drains into the harbor at Charleston. The Cooper River begins 50 miles inland in two places. The two streams join at a fork, and then the river winds down to Charleston Harbor. This is a map from 1842 showing the plantations on the Cooper River. You can see the fork in the upper middle of the picture. The Ball places all stood on the right-hand fork, the eastern branch of the Cooper River, side by side, separated from each other by a half mile to a mile. The Balls bought and built more. This was Quenby Plantation, another house built before the Revolution. And this is a painting of Quenby Plantation, showing the acres around it. As the years passed and the family's wealth grew, the Balls built fine houses for themselves in Charleston, which was the style. This house, known as the Isaac Ball House, went up in 1813. It was torn down in 1920. Standing in its place today is a Blockbuster video store. It was really a compound more than a house. A block square surrounded by an 8-foot brick wall, the mansion in front, and behind it, carriage houses, a garden, and a long tenement for the black families. In the census records from 1820, it shows that 4 members of the Ball family lived in the mansion itself, and 18 black people lived behind it and actually made the house function. Some of the records kept by the Balls include many lists of slaves. And on some lists, there are the appraised values of each individual. At the top of this list, a man called Bob at Pimlico, one of the Ball places, was described as the driver, which is to say the plantation foreman, who actually ran the work gangs. And he is the most valuable man on this property, appraised at $500. The best known of the ancestors would be a man named Henry Lawrence, who married a woman named Eleanor Ball in 1750. The wedding took place at the Cumming-T house, whose picture I've shown. Henry Lawrence went into business with George Austin, who was married to Anne Ball, Eleanor's sister. And their firm, Austin and Lawrence, became the largest slave importing company in British North America. Between 1750 and 1760, Austin and Lawrence imported 8,000 Africans to Charleston, selling them to their in-laws, the Balls, and to hundreds of other plantation-owning families. They took a commission of 10%. The balance of the payments went to England, into the pocket of the financier who actually owned the slave galleys. When the ships arrived, Austin and Lawrence placed ads in the local newspaper, the South Carolina Gazette, advertising where the ships had come from. This was very important to the white folks because there developed this belief that Africans from different cultures had different characteristics. Gambians from the river Gambia were thought to be good rice farmers because rice was a staple crop in Gambia. And the plantations of South Carolina were rice plantations. So Gambians were well sought out by the Balls and people like them. Angolans, who came from the mouth of the Congo River, 2,500 miles south, were thought to be good mechanics who could build and operate farm equipment, such as pounding equipment that would strip the husk from the rice grain. People who were least prized were the Igbo from the delta of the Niger River. They were presumed to be docile and therefore not bad as valets, according to what the white folks wrote down, but they were thought to be melancholic as a group and subject to suicide. There's some circumstantial evidence that corroborates this view. Near Sapelo Island, Georgia, there's a boat landing called Igbo Landing. So called because as the slave galleys pulled up to the dock, Igbos were known to throw themselves into the ocean to drown themselves before the boat actually reached shore. Some more of the ads taken out by Austin and Lawrence advertising the arrival of Angolans. The firm Austin and Lawrence kept very good records, some of which led to this place, Bunce Island, in the mouth of the Sierra Leone River on the West African coast. Bunce Island was one of the many prisons where people were held before they were loaded onto ships and sent to Charleston. The others that are well known are Gorée Island and Elmina Castle in Ghana. The records show that some of the Ball family slaves came from this place. There's a paper trail that leads there. It's not oral tradition. This is a watercolor from the 1760s that shows what it looked like when Henry Lawrence and George Austin were taking people from Bunce Island. Those who tried to run away were normally Africans, because it was the Africans who had some memory of what it was like to be free as a child. This is an ad taken out by Elias Ball, Jr. in the 1760s, seeking the retrieval of Primus, Caesar, and Boson, who had fled one of his plantations. There's a description of what they had on, of physical markings such as scars, and the offer of £5 reward. This is another ad taken out by Elias Ball, Jr., advertising for the retrieval of two men named Tom and Jemmy. Henry Lawrence again. In the slave business, he became very wealthy, and then he went into politics. He became president of something called the Council of Safety, which was a committee charged with the defense of Charleston against British conquest during the Revolution. In 1778, he was elected president of the Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia. He came to Philadelphia. From there, he was sent to Holland to negotiate a loan that would keep the Continental Army in the field. But while at sea, he was captured by the British and brought to London, where he was jailed in the Tower of London until the end of the Revolution. When the war was concluded, he was exchanged for Lord Cornwallis, who was a prisoner of the Americans. Then Lawrence was sent to Paris to negotiate the preliminary peace treaty with the British in the company of Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, John Adams, and William Temple Franklin, Ben Franklin's grandson. This is an unfinished painting by Benjamin West, a portraitist, that shows that meeting in Paris, the peace treaty unrolled on the table in front of the men. Another story that comes out of the Revolution that I find equally compelling involves a black man named Boston King, who was a slave to the Balls at this place, Tranquil Hill Plantation, the property of Anne Ball and her husband, Richard Waring. At the start of the Revolution, the British announced that any black people who fled their American owners and got to British lines would be given freedom. In South Carolina, some 12,000 people did just that, including Boston King, who was 19 at the time. He fled Tranquil Hill and got to Charleston, got onto a ship bound for the Chesapeake. There, he got onto another ship bound for New York. But in New York, he was recaptured and re-enslaved by some Americans in New Jersey. He escaped a second time, got back to New York, and at the end of the war, when the British evacuated the United States, he boarded one of the ships in the flotilla of the evacuation, and along with 3,000 other escaped blacks, went to Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, he married a woman named Phyllis, got educated, became a Methodist preacher, and founded a congregation, living in the village of Birchtown. A few years passed, and the British once again offered to resettle the black families who had fled the United States, but now this time in West Africa. So in 1792, Boston King and his wife Phyllis and members of their congregation got onto yet another ship and joined an exodus to Sierra Leone, where they settled in the village of Freetown, which is now the capital of that country. This is a painting from 1792 that shows the arrival of that flotilla in Freetown Harbor. So an amazing saga of a teenager who fled the rice plantations on the Balls' property lists, got to Nova Scotia, and finally back to West Africa, where his father had come from. But there's one footnote to this that's, for me, even more interesting. In Sierra Leone, Boston King caught the eye of some Methodist missionaries, who then invited him to London for further Bible study. Once in England, he sat down and wrote a brief memoir called The Memoirs of Boston King, which was published in the 1790s, an autobiography. Then he returned to West Africa, where he died, becoming one of the first authors of what would be called slave narratives, and becoming the only former Ball slave who would ever publish his autobiography. After the Revolution, the Ball properties were largely depopulated, and their records show that some half of the men had actually fled. John Ball was patriarch of the clan after the war, and he repopulated the plantations by buying more Africans. The housing for the black families was also rebuilt. Archaeological evidence shows that the first housing was made of clay, but after the Revolution it was rebuilt in wood, and a typical housing type emerged. It was a railroad cottage, narrow and long, with 2 rooms in it. One family lived in one room, one in the other. In the wall separating the rooms, there was a single chimney with 2 faces, 2 fireplaces, one facing one room, one facing the other. 5 to 10 people in each room, and so 10 to 20 people in each one of these houses. This is a photograph of the slave street at Cumming Tea Plantation. This is one of my favorite Ball ancestors, Martha Caroline Swinton Ball, who is known affectionately in the family as Buzzard Wing. Buzzard Wing was 19 when she married John Ball, whose picture I've shown you earlier, a widower. John Ball's first wife, Jane, who was actually his first cousin, Jane Ball, and therefore Jane Ball Ball, had died, leaving behind 5 grown children. And at 44, John Ball remarried to 19-year-old Buzzard Wing. She was a gold digger of the first rank and immediately began spending through his fortune. The children of John's first wife hated Buzzard Wing. According to family tradition, Jane Ball, by contrast, was a devout, frugal, God-fearing woman, my ancestor. And the descendants of Jane Ball still talk about Buzzard Wing today. This was in 1805. I'm going to show you some photographs from the 1800s on the Ball places, just to give you an idea of what people looked like, how they lived, without going through the story in great detail. Children were put to work about age 6 as water carriers, bringing water to the fields. They were put to work in the fields themselves about aged 12. This is a woman whose story should not be overlooked. Anne Simmons Ball, known in the family as Captain Nancy. Captain Nancy because she had a reputation for severity. Captain Nancy's life gives the lie to the conventional wisdom that the white women kept their hands out of plantation management, leaving the men to do all the work of discipline. She was the wife of John Ball Jr. and a co-equal with her husband in the managing their properties. She wrote many letters to John saying, "John, don't you think you're being too lenient with those people? Don't you think you should separate those people from one another? They're giving you trouble." And in 1835, she wrote a letter that still is fixed in my memory, describing a run-in that she had with the laundress, a woman named Betty. Betty had brought some towels to Mrs. Ball that she had cleaned, and Mrs. Ball wasn't satisfied, so she returned them to be washed again. Betty came back with the clean towels. Mrs. Ball wasn't satisfied. Betty washed them again. On the third time, Mrs. Ball went into a rage, and she wrote her husband describing what happened next. She said, "John, I took down the whip that we keep on the dressing room table, and I struck her with it on the shoulders several times. And she was so astonished that it almost made me laugh. So I then sent her to the workhouse. The workhouse was the building in Charleston dedicated to the detention and punishment of black people. If you were a valet or a butler or a cook in Charleston and you had a run-in with your master, you might be sent to the workhouse for punishment. It was run by the city, and there was a civil servant whose job it was to beat people for a fee. The fee was 25 cents for a whipping. There was also a treadmill 15 feet in diameter with steps on it, on which people were required to walk for 8 hours at a time. The workhouse to which Captain Nancy sent Betty for her just reward. The Civil War came. This is an engraving from a London newspaper that shows the bombardment of Charleston by Yankee gunboats in the year 1863. When the war broke out, 10 members of the Ball family joined the Confederate armies, among them my great-grandfather, Isaac Ball, who enlisted in the 1st South Carolina Light Artillery and was sent to John's Island at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, along with 3,000 other men, to defend the city against an invasion that was being attempted from further down the coast. Black men served with white men side by side in the Confederacy. This man was named Nat from a Ball place called Quenby, and he was Isaac Ball's valet. At the end of the war, he took the name Watson, becoming Nat Watson. But during the fighting, he was in the Confederate camps with the Ball brothers and cousins, carrying their food, carrying their packs, cleaning their clothes, bringing their letters to and from home, and doing all the other things that they asked him to do. Charleston fell in February 1865, and the first unit to enter the city was the 55th Massachusetts Colored Infantry. The Ball plantations rapidly declined. The Balls tried to set themselves up as sharecrop landlords with limited success. About half of the freed people decided to stay, but rice dwindled rapidly as a staple crop in the face of competition from Louisiana and from Asia. And by the year 1900, all the Ball places had shut down. At the end of the Civil War, the Balls owned 11 plantations. 25 years later, they owned 3, and 25 years after that, 2. This is Isaac Ball, the Confederate soldier, my great-grandfather, with his wife, Mary Louisa Ball, in 1925, near the end of their lives. Among their children was Nat Ball, standing in the middle here, my grandfather, my father's father. Nat's sons included my father on the left, Theodore Ball, and my uncle on the right, Nat Jr., photographed here in Charleston in the 1930s, after the Balls had moved from the plantations to Charleston and taken up middle-class professions. Isaac Ball came from Limerick Plantation, and so that's where my branch comes from. Another person who came from Limerick was Henry. He was born Henry in 1855 at Limerick. 9 years later, he was freed. He took the name Martin, and he put the name Peter in front of his name, becoming Peter Henry Martin, sitting here in the middle in a photograph from the 1890s. Peter Henry Martin grew up, became a carpenter and a preacher, and settled in a village called Pinopolis, north of Charleston. He married a woman named Anna Cruz. They had 7 children. In the 1920s, when Peter Martin was an old man, he began to write letters to the Balls, his former enslavers, and they went something like this. Dear Massa Isaac, do you remember when the Yankees came to Limerick and they tried to burn the house? Do you remember the names of the bird dogs, Bounce and Bill? Do you remember the names of the horses? Do you remember what we call that field just beyond our house? They were nostalgic letters, full of remembrance, and the Balls saved them. 75 years later, I had photocopies of these letters in hand, and they became my first clue for finding the descendants of the Ball family slaves. None in my own family knew where the people might have gone, and so what I did, with the help of a friend, was to start phoning people with the surname Martin in the tiny towns from which the letters had been postmarked in the 1920s. And very quickly I found the Wright Martin family. At the far left of the picture is Peter Jr., who grew up and became a roofer in Charleston. Peter Jr.'s son, Thomas Martin, attended Tuskegee Institute, returned to Charleston, became a teacher and then an assistant school principal at Burke High School, a black high school in the city, where he worked for 27 years before retiring in the early 1990s. One January day, I knocked on Thomas Martin's door with the letters in my hand. He knew nothing about his grandfather's origins. He'd never heard of Limerick Plantation, much less been there. He didn't know that the Martin family had been enslaved by the Balls. He knew a lot about his grandfather's adult life, where he had taught, where he'd built, and I knew nothing about that. And together, we tried to puzzle these things out and reconstruct the family narrative from slavery to freedom. We were also electrified merely by being in the same room together. After some time passed and we began to trust each other, it was one of our ideas to visit Limerick Plantation, the place from which the Martins had come. The Balls no longer own any of the plantations. Most of them are owned by rich Northerners. So I contacted the current owners of Limerick, and Thomas Martin and I went there and looked around. He's a dignified man, a reticent man, a few words, few emotions. But it was very powerful going back here, for him and for me. And as we walked under the oak trees of Limerick, Mr. Martin leaned over and said, "I feel like I'm walking in the footsteps of Jesus." Very few of the freed people took the name Ball, maybe 1 in 20. Others took names from 10 miles away or 20 miles away. This family took the name Ball. This is a picture of a Joseph Ball, photographed during World War II when he was a supply sergeant. He came from the town of Marion, South Carolina. He went on to fight in North Africa and in the Rhineland campaign in Germany in 1945. He returned to Marion, became a teacher and then a school principal. He died in the 1980s. All of his family are still in the military. I'm in touch with them. He has a daughter, Jackie Ball, whom I saw in D.C. yesterday. She's a petty officer in the Navy who works in the Pentagon in some secret function that she refuses to disclose to me. She tells me only that she has a paper shredder. And Jackie's daughter, LaShawn, who's an Army nurse at Walter Reed. This woman was the last mom, what some Southerners called Mammy, at Cumming Tea Plantation. Her name was Mary Ann. She took the name Royal at the end of the Civil War, becoming Mary Ann Royal. I walked some of the dirt roads and two-lane blacktops around the old Ball places, knocking on people's doors, trying to find out if anyone had oral tradition about where they had come from. Sometimes people shut the door in my face because I asked intrusive questions. Sometimes they didn't, and in this way I found the descendants of Mary Ann Royal. Georgiana Gadsden Richardson, who lived and died 3 miles from Cumming Tea, where her family had been in slavery for many generations. This is a photograph of Georgie Richardson in the 1960s with her husband Robert and some of their nieces and nephews. This is a photograph of Mrs. Richardson the day we met with 2 of her great-grands. She could neither read nor write, but she had profound memory of the aftermath of slavery, and she taught me a great deal. She taught me how people got by after freedom, how they cut pine from the plantation forest in order to build log cabins, how they built chimneys from clay because no one could afford to buy brick, and how during rainstorms they had to climb on ladders to repair those chimneys because the clay would be washed down into the house. How they drank water from the Cooper River, scooping it up in buckets and shaking the bucket to make the silt settle. How they set traps for carp in the river. Mrs. Richardson died last fall. This is one of her daughters, Barbara Jean Brown, whom I saw in Charleston about 6 weeks ago. This is a list of people bought at auction by the Balls in the year 1818. Some 60 people with their appraised value. At the top of the list is a family of 9, appraised at $5,400. I found the descendants of that family. Wesley Simmons, who's sitting here in front of the house that his family built not far from Buck Hall, the Ball place from which they had been freed, photographed about 1915. And Wesley Simmons' daughter, Katie Simmons, in the 1930s, photographed in a coat that she tells me she bought in New York. She's now 86. One of Katie Simmons' daughters, Charlotte Roper, who's now 48, but at one time was a very cute second grader. One of Mrs. Roper's, Katie Simmons Roper's other daughters, Dolores Singletary, photographed in the grocery store that was the family business in the 1960s and 70s. There are about 150 members of this family who are aware of each other. They live in 10 states, all up and down the eastern seaboard. At the beginning of the 1900s, they began to trickle north. After World War I, more left. After World War II, a great many left, and they settled in every state east of the Mississippi. If people came from Georgia or the Carolinas, the destinations were Baltimore, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York. Of course, if you came from Mississippi or Alabama, your destination was Chicago. This is a man named James Pius, who was a Ball cousin, who was a descendant of Elias Redcap Ball, as I am. James Pius never married, and there is much evidence to demonstrate that he had a relationship with a woman he owned named Diana, and they had a child named Frederick. Frederick took the name Pius, and their descendants live in several states. There are people with whom I have blood kinship and with whom I have been meeting for some time. Frederick Pius, sitting at the right side of this picture, has a striking resemblance to James, his reputed father. This drawing from about 1890 is in the hands of Frederick's descendants. Freddie Mae Pius, standing at the right side of this picture, with her husband Postal Smalls and some of their great-grands at their 50th wedding anniversary in 1991 or 92. Carolyn Smalls, on the right side of the picture, on her first date with her future husband James Goodson, photographed just about the time the film Superfly was released. Carolyn Goodson is a resident of Philadelphia, and she invited me to visit her, and when she opened the door, she embraced me. I'd never seen her before. Carolyn is a person who believes that the only answer to the disaster that brought our families together, the disaster that befell her family at the hands of my family, is love and acceptance. Leon Smalls, Carolyn's brother, a tractor-trailer driver for the Ford Motor Company, member of the Masonic Lodge in Chester, Pennsylvania, lives not far from Carolyn. When we met, Mr. Smalls had an obvious bitterness and anguish about what had happened to what he called my people. And it was clear that he understood the role my family had had in persecuting his people. And I think it might have been difficult for him to be in the same room with me. I'd like to ask that the lights be turned on because this family is here tonight, and I want to introduce them. Mother Pius is here. Would you all mind standing up? Thank you for coming. All right. Could we bring the lights back down? This is another man whose family tradition states that there was a man named Ball and a woman in the rice fields who were the founding couple of his family. And another man who came from a white man and a black woman. This is Edwin Harleston, whose grandparents were a man called William Harleston, a Ball cousin, and one of William Harleston's slaves, a woman named Kate Wilson. They had a relationship that lasted for some 25 years, and they had 8 children. Kate Wilson lived in a house in Charleston that William Harleston had built for her, although they did not cohabit. Among their grandchildren was Edwin Harleston, this man. The Harlestons founded a funeral home in Charleston, which survives today after 100 years in business, and this became the engine of that family's prosperity. Edwin Harleston was able to go to college, to Atlanta University, in 1898. After graduating from Atlanta, he wanted to become a painter, so he went to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts to study in the art school there. Became a portraitist. This is a photograph of Harleston in his yard at his easel. He was a serious painter, and he had a dual career. He ran the funeral home, and he painted. He was one of the few black Americans to have a serious career in the arts in the early decades of this century. But because of Jim Crow, he never got a show during his lifetime. The year after he died, some of his paintings were exhibited at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. While he was a student at Atlanta University, he befriended one of the members of the faculty, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was teaching in Atlanta and at the time writing his book, The Souls of Black Folk, the founding manifesto of black consciousness in the 20th century in the United States. Du Bois befriended Harleston, and Du Bois went on to co-found the NAACP and to become the editor of The Crisis, the NAACP magazine. Du Bois would come to Charleston from time to time on NAACP business, and at his encouragement, Edwin Harleston founded the Charleston branch of that organization. This is a photograph that shows Du Bois standing at the center with a cane and Harleston on the far left during one of Du Bois's visits to Charleston. Under Edwin Harleston's leadership, the NAACP managed to break down the color barrier to black teachers in the public school system and to equalize pay scales of black and white teachers. This whole family has artists and musicians and writers in it straight down to today. This is a man named Ray Fleming, part of the Harleston clan, born in Charleston, who had a career as a rhythm and blues songwriter in the 1960s. In the 1970s, he was a producer of disco music. And now he lives in Los Angeles, where he produces black easy listening. This is one of the youngest members of the Harleston family. Sylvia, who lives in Atlanta. And Sylvia's sister Allison, also of Atlanta. There are many people who deserve credit for this book, but chief among them are the black families, some of whom I'm related to, who have opened their lives to me and allowed me into their homes and into their hearts. Without their courage, it would not have been possible for me to reconnect our stories, and I'm very grateful to them. I'm also grateful to members of my own family for whom it's been very painful and difficult to reawaken these memories. And I'm grateful to the many strangers who've contacted me over the years, in the last 3 years, to encourage me. What I've done is to write a shared history, black with white, side by side, 300 years in duration, because that is, after all, how people lived. It's not a segregated history. We don't need any more white history on the one side and black history on the other. We have a deeper need for a shared history, because that's the way America has grown. And with the help of all these people, I've learned that we can overcome some of our fear, and we can release some of our anguish, and we can put the past to rest. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Thank you. Before I take questions, this story has acquired some momentum, and I think it's going to evolve into another stage, though I'm not sure exactly what. People are continuing to contact me, and many people have asked me, well, what's going to happen next? So what I'd like to do, for those of you who are interested in what's going to happen next, is to pass around some legal pads, and if you're curious, write down your name and address, and I promise to send a bulletin in 6 months to a year that says, well, this has occurred. Now, of course, you're not obliged to put down your name and address, but I'll send around these blank pads, and do so if you like, and at the end I can collect them and put you on a mailing list. Does anyone have a question? Yes.
First of all, I admire the enormous amount of work you did, and I now understand why it took you just 3 years. Your family had tremendous desire to keep records. That makes it quite good for the person who does the work. There are two, and with respect to your work, but there seem to be two glaring omissions in this. And perhaps it would be separate books to address them. You mentioned a couple of times that in the beginning of when the plantations were taken over by Red Cow Ball, that there were American Indians who were also on the slave plantations. What about their lineage?
Very difficult to find. The question was, there are two glaring omissions. One is the Native American story, and the short answer is the documentation just isn't there to tell their story. Go ahead.
The second one is, I'm sure many people here have known of or heard of offspring of mixed couples, black and white. One, say if they have two children, one is decidedly phenotypically black, the other one is decidedly phenotypically white and can, as was called, pass. Many did. I even knew someone in the 70s who was a very fair-skinned black woman, and I never saw her with anyone other than white people. That is a source of carrying African blood, if you will, into an otherwise, superficially, totally white European family. They would never know, but it obviously is there. I think I called in your show and asked about the one-drop rule. Those of people here probably know what that means, that if you had one drop of black blood, you were considered black, period. Now, the thing, also on one of your other interviews, you said they had family members, I believe in South Carolina, who were a member of a agency or group or some sort of club, that one of the hidden regulations of being a member of the club was you had to be descended from white slave owners.
The other question is the
So
overlooked story of people who pass. And why, I guess the question is, why didn't I try to uncover people who came from Afro-American backgrounds who passed into the Ball family?
That's another branch.
Right. Fair enough. The answer to that is there may well have been. And it would not surprise me if people passed and passed into the Ball family. This, of course, would be the most taboo subject for both those who passed and those in the white society who accepted them. And for that reason, the memory of it is suffocated. It's very difficult to prove. People won't even talk about it. Those who pass won't even talk about it. I did find a woman in South Carolina whose kin, who were darker than she was, claimed that she had crossed over. But she wouldn't return phone calls. And she wouldn't even return the calls of her kin who were darker than she was. So the memory of it is choked, and it's most difficult to uncover. I would not be surprised at incidents of this kind. And that's another story that could be told. I admit it's an omission. In the back, yes.
Yeah, I have a few things I'd like to say. My name is Peg Shaw, and I'm a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee. It's an organization that's a part of the Uhuru movement, which is an organization that's led by the African working class in this country that's resisting the attacks that are coming down on it by the U.S. government. And I just want to say, as a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee, I really salute the work that you've been doing with this book and also the tour that you've been holding for that. But I do want to say that, you know, as important as it is to make a self-criticism and an apology for not only the past but the present, and you know, not only the riches that the white population has gained through the enslavement of African people in this country and the genocide of the indigenous people in this country, but also to realize that is still happening today, and that the only real apology I think that we can make is to build a movement of reparations to the African community in this country and around the world. And I just want to say that that's something that the Uhuru movement is building here in Philadelphia and around the country, and I want to invite people to get involved with that. We have some literature I've been handing out. I was handing out some literature about this before your presentation this evening, and will be available afterwards. But I also wanted to ask you to make some comments about the issue of reparations. And I guess that was it.
All right. I think the discussion of reparations should be allowed to get on its feet in America. I know that the issue is alive in black society. I know that I have not yet met a white person who does not roll his or her eyes at the mention of the word reparations. So black people and white people are very far apart on this, but I encourage white folks to listen to what black people are saying and to give them the respect of their attention. And I think that the debate should get on its feet. Now, where it's going to lead, it's too early to say, because it hasn't even breathed yet. But I permit and encourage discussion of reparations. When I went to West Africa last year, the subject of reparations came up very frequently among politicians that I met. So I know that it's very alive. I can say more about it later if anyone wants to have a follow-up question. Yes?
You mentioned the letters that you would find. I was curious how you would start to chart where people fit into the home family network. Did you use a computer? Did you, because when you start to read these letters, everybody starts to blend together. What did you use to assist yourself so you could methodically picture everybody where they fit? Because you did it so smoothly with the presentation, it was obvious that you almost had a mental picture of where everybody was.
I reconstructed family trees of both black folks and white folks using a computer program, plugging everybody in so that I could have the genealogies of dozens of families in slavery and see how they interconnected with one another, in addition to the genealogy of the Ball family itself. And I relied on computers to make notes, so that was a big help, yeah. Yes?
I've never heard of the workhouse. Is that something that the Ball family of the 25 plantations, they shared a workhouse, or is that something very common in southern plantations?
The workhouse was in the city of Charleston. The plantations were 25 miles away from Charleston. It was built by the government in Charleston itself and operated by the city, the government of the city of Charleston. And it was the detention center and punishment center for black people, where people would be sent if they were disobedient, or if you were a runaway who had been recaptured, you would be brought there so that your owner would know where to retrieve you. So it was not built by the Balls, and the Balls were one of many, many families who used the services of the workhouse. Yes?
I am extremely gratified to hear about your story. My name is Mark Still, and I've been doing the same thing, somewhat, that you've been doing for the past year or so. I've been trying to, I established the connection between the Cherokee side of my family and the white side of my family about 7 years ago. Last year, I went to a Still family reunion. Some people here might know that the Stills and Lawn side have some fame, very deserving. William Still was an abolitionist who worked in the Underground Railroad. His fame was probably second only to Harriet Tubman's. Dr. James Still was known as the Black Doctor of the Pines. He was so good that all the other doctors in the area, all the white doctors, that would dismiss him and say, well, what does he know? He's just a black man. Would eventually come to him when they got sick, because he had the cures that no one else had. And Dr. James Still had the biggest house in Medford in the mid-1900s, at a time when that just was unheard of. So when I read about your story in the Inquirer on Sunday, first of all, I was excited to hear that someone else is doing the same thing and has been so successful at it. And second of all, I was a little bit dismayed that it's such a unique and wonderful thing what you did, that it has been getting all this national attention. I had the idea that many people would be doing the same sort of thing, would be trying to bring all their families together, despite differences in culture and ethnicities. And unfortunately, I guess that's not true. But I want to get on the bandwagon and thank you and say it's a wonderful job. Also, the next Still family reunion, which will be in June in can tell you more about it later. But unfortunately, it fell upon me to give a keynote speech at this reunion to link all the different races together. The Cherokee with the black, with the white, possibly some Choctaw. So again, fantastic. Thank you. More power to you.
Well, thank you. In the back. Yes.
My name is Mary Geddes Brunson. I'm from Charleston, South Carolina. To answer the young man's question in the beginning when he was asking about the passing, Charleston was very well known for that. And to cross that line, you have to really talk to an individual to find out if they want to be called black.
If they want to be outed.
The second question was, you had 3 men, and you said one of them was Nathan Ball,
Nathaniel.
Nathaniel Ball. Was he a construction contractor?
That's my grandfather, you're right.
Okay, well, my uncle that just passed last May worked for him until he went to business for himself.
Is that right? I'll be damned.
No, not Ball, I'm Geddes.
All right.
2 parts. Do you have any sense from the records how many families were kept together among the slaves and how many just dispersed? And second part of the question, did you have a sense that the Ball family actually bred slaves for sale as we breed hogs and cattle now?
Question was, did I have any sense of whether the families in slavery were kept together or broken apart by sale? And secondly, was there any evidence that the Balls bred slaves as farmers breed hogs and cattle? And the answer to the first question is the custom among families like my own was to keep families together. And the custom was occasionally violated. And there is evidence that families were broken apart by sale. The oral tradition in the family, in my family, is often repeated that the Balls did not separate families by sale. But I went to the archives in Columbia, South Carolina, and found receipts for the purchase and sale of people that documented this practice. It didn't happen all the time. It didn't even happen once a month. But it happened. And the second question, did the Balls breed people? I don't think so. I don't think so. I'm not sure what the evidence would look like that would demonstrate this. I know that the population of black families increased rapidly over many generations on the Ball lands. But there's less evidence that these people, these young people, were sold once they grew up. In fact, there's not much evidence of that. So I don't think so. Yes?
Could you speak to the extent that you can as to one of the things that strikes me about the presentation is that you hear so often people say, well, slavery was long ago, and I didn't own slaves, usually, you know, Caucasian people saying this. And what strikes me is that the legacy is very close to us in terms of the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren and the great-great-grandchildren. Can you speak to the sense that you have some sense of the pulse of the psychic need of white America to distance themselves from slavery as part of the perpetuation of the myth of we've made it on our own and we have no responsibility, that there is almost this denial in America that implicit in whiteness is the association or the imbuing of privilege and class, that somehow these things don't exist?
After the Civil War, there was a period of purposeful forgetting among both black and white families. I've met many Afro-American families who say that their grandparents and great-grands did not talk about being in slavery and refused to talk about it. So there was an intentional erasure of memory because it was so painful. On the white side, my own family and families like it participated in a similar erasure of memory, and as they began to write down their family narratives and formalize their lore, black people disappeared from the lore, such that the white lore is populated only by whites, even though the ratio of black people to white people on the plantations was something like 10 to 1. So there was a long period of purposeful forgetting, which continues to this day. Now, many white folks point out, rightly, that their ancestors didn't own slaves. And here's what I say about that. I think that the legacy of slavery imprints itself on white life just as powerfully as it does on black life today. And that includes not just the descendants of slave owners, but all white Americans. Let's say that your ancestors were Sicilian peasants. Let's say that they were Russian Jews. Let's say that they were Irish potato farmers. And they were part of the 40% of Americans who came through Ellis Island. They were tired. They were homeless. They were yearning to breathe free. Their suffering was real. Their suffering cannot be denied. But the moment they set foot in the United States, they entered the upper tier of a two-tier caste society and automatically were enabled to get jobs, housing, and education before native-born black people. And this leg up continues to this very day. So all white Americans benefit from the legacy of slavery. And it's our job to try to recognize that, to acknowledge that, and to be accountable for it. We are in a society that is based on individual freedom and aspiration, on the glorification of opportunity, and on the will of the individual. But we're also in a society that was founded on cruelty and violence. And that's the second face of America, as clear and recognizable as the first face. America is both things, and we have that legacy right to today.
I called in this morning. I'm another descendant of slave owners from South Carolina. And I spoke then, and I want to reiterate that now, just how grateful I am and what a relief it was to me to get the truth about my family, because I think it's harder on all of us to deny what our past is about than to try and live with a lie. My question is, what are the elements of healing that you are seeing needing to be present as we move forward together? Obviously, getting the truth out is one of them, but what are some of the other, and the love that your relative and you have shared is clearly another one, but I think there's some tougher pieces as well. What is your experience with what are the elements of healing that we can be ready for and open ourselves to?
I'm an individual. I'm not a foundation. I'm not a government agency. I'm a writer who's told a story. And what's compelling about the story is that it brings black and white histories together that had been separated. I've found that that mere act has medicinal value. There's a deep wound on the body of America, left there by slavery. And there are poisons embedded in that wound, and they have to be released. And what I've tried to do is to break open the wound, which is painful, to release some of those poisons. It's probably the most painful part of the healing process, is to lance the wound. And that's the stage that I'm at. And that's the message that I'm bringing. To let these things come to light and to stop stifling their memory. I think that we should enter on a period of commemoration of the legacy of slavery. You know, this was the institution on which the United States was founded. There are no monuments to it. There are no museums to it. There are no places of pilgrimage where you can go and have an experience of catharsis and memory and understanding. There's a place called Sullivan's Island at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, which was the point of entry for many of the slave galleys coming from West Africa. The records show that some 40% of the Africans brought to the territory of the future United States arrived at Sullivan's Island, which is to say that 40% of black Americans have ancestors who set foot in America for the first time on this little spit of sand. The same figure applies to Ellis Island. 40% of Americans came through Ellis Island. On Sullivan's Island, there is no monument. There's no museum. There's not even a hand-painted sign that would say what happened there. I think that one step, perhaps the next step, is for us to begin to try to memorialize this past and bring it into consciousness.
I teach an African history course over in New Jersey, and Sunday, at the Inquirer, I cut it out, ran it off to my African history class, and we read it in class. And I told them that I would be attending the program today. They wanted me to ask 2 questions. One, why do you really feel this personal need to reconcile something that you had really no hand in? And number 2, the black people that you've met on your side of the family, do they feel that you need to reconcile something?
The question was, why do I feel the personal need to reconcile this history in which I had no hand? And secondly, among the black families, do they feel that I have to reconcile something with them? Well, I think that the descendants of slave owners are not personally responsible for the past, because we could not have influenced the deeds of our ancestors. And therefore, we are not culpable, as criminals would be culpable of a crime. However, I think that we are accountable for the past, because its legacy has shaped our lives very powerfully, and we owe it to ourselves to speak about it, to make an account of it, an accounting of it, to make a record of it, in the spirit of honesty, rather than remain silent about it, which is what we've learned to do since childhood. Whether the black families I've worked with believe that I have to reconcile myself with them, well, you'd have to ask them. I can't speak for them. I don't know, Carolyn, do you have anything to say on this subject? You don't have to, or Mr. Smalls?
I will remain silent.
All right.
Read Written in the Blood in the book, and then you will respond.
There's a chapter in my book about Mr. Small's family. I think that each individual, Afro-American, has a different way of assimilating and incorporating this tragedy into their lives. Some believe that someone like myself has nothing to say to them, and some are profoundly moved by the fact that I've made the effort to find them at all. And it varies from person to person and place to place.
Do you have, or have you made some assessment of the number of large plantation families similar to your own? And how many people from any of those families has contacted you thus far?
Do I have any idea of the number of large plantation families such as my own, and how many people from those families has contacted me thus far? At the beginning of the Civil War, there were 400,000 slave owners. Most of them were not large plantation owners. Nevertheless, the descendants of those people number in the tens of millions of Americans today. And most of us know who we are, because this legacy is something that is kept. It's part of the legends and lore of most of these families. Maybe 10 families have contacted me over the last 2 years, something like that, looking for encouragement, looking for answers. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to commend you for the work that you've done. I think that the writing skills definitely are the ones that curiosity and all that really keeps going, and probably the things that you continually heard. As someone who has experienced the oral history and have a niece who has been obsessed with finding the facts and researching the family. I can say that essentially on the African American side, if you're trying to uncover those same things, the path is not always straight and it's not always easy, because a lot of the historical societies in the South would not allow her in. And secondly, there were certain kinds of thoughts that, well, you'll have to pay to have this copy. And, you know, of course she was willing to pay. But I want you to know that the chore is not as easy for an African American doing the same kind of research. But I think it is equally as valuable that maybe the mere fact that you have done this will allow all of those young African American researchers and writers who are interested in the topic to really come forward, and maybe you'll open some doors for them.
Fair enough. 3 more questions. Yes, ma'am.
Not a question, but I'd like to commend you too for it. Because here lately I've been thinking the same thing. I said to myself, I wonder why some white people don't try to look, you know, to see who their relatives, because we're related. A lot of us are related. We don't know each other. And yet, if we knew each other, we wouldn't have so much hatred towards one another today. I think it would be much better. Because it is a lot of people, because I'm from South Carolina too, but not from that part. And I also went to that island, I met him in Sullivan's Island, where the trees meet, where the slaves would come up, you know, from the river and come into the, you know, South Carolina. So I was hoping that a lot of, you touched me when I read that article to know that someone white is interested in finding out who they're related to, because we are related, a lot of us are. We don't know each other, but we are.
True. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ball, the U.S. Census of 1850 defines plantations as having more than 2,000 acres. The U.S. Census of 1850 also counted 8,352 plantations that grew hemp. It's very hard to find any information on this, as it's been prohibited for over 60 years now. I'm wondering if you know that any of your 20 or so plantations.
Well, that's the deepest family secret. And I'm really sorry you have uncovered that skeleton. I'm not aware. Maybe in Virginia. Wasn't it common in Virginia? Because tobacco...
It was actually mandatory to pay your taxes with it. You could be jailed for not growing it when George Washington was there.
In Virginia?
That's correct.
Right. I'm not aware of it in South Carolina, but that doesn't mean that hemp was not grown. That's an interesting footnote. In the back, yes.
As an African American, I'm constantly in flux in terms of where I am with regards to white America with my country. And because the school system does not offer a fair handling of American history, which is, you know, what we're getting here today. And I think we have to readjust and fine-tune a little bit our idea of America. And I believe that you understand what America is. It does have those two faces, and we have the tendency not to look at America's violent face. And like it or not, we have to accept that, because that is how the country was founded.
This is the last question. Yes, sir.
First, I want to commend you on the job well done. Just based on the articles I read and news reports, going into the education, as she mentioned, and the historians that are here and family members, you ran into roadblocks as you attempted to retrieve your own history from your family. We as African Americans are always kept from our own history through the miseducation of the Negro, as written by Carter G. Woodson in his own book. Therefore, when we are given opportunity to meet someone like yourself who's going to bring it to us, I say on behalf of everybody, I'm quite sure that we're blessed. And I just want to commend you for that.
Well, thank you, sir. Very kind. And thank you all for coming. I'm going to go out here in the lobby and sign some books. All right. Hope to see you.